They laughed first at the hardware store. Evan Calder stood in the aisle between roofing nails and insulation rolls, pushing a cart that rattled under the weight of treated lumber and thick sheets of corrugated metal. His beard was dusted with sawdust, his flannel faded from too many winters, and his hands, scarred, steady, held a folded sketch he'd drawn on the back of a feed receipt. 2 roofs, one above the other, a wide air gap between them. Building a barn or a spaceship, Hank Mullins called out from the paint counter, loud enough for half the store to hear. A couple of guys snorted, someone else chuckled and shook their head. Evan didn't look up right away. He set the sketch on the counter, smoothed it flat, and waited until the laughter thinned into that familiar mountain store silence. Boots scuffing concrete, a radio murmuring country music, the smell of oil and pine. "Second roof," Evan said calmly. Hank blinked. "Second what?" "Roof over the cabin." That did it. Laughter came back harder this time, bouncing off the metal shelves. "You planning on flying it away when winter hits?" someone said. Evan folded the sketch again, slower now. He felt the heat creep up his neck but kept his voice even. "It's for snow load, wind shear, insulation." Hank leaned over the counter, squinting like he was trying to see a joke hidden between the lines. "Son, I've lived up here 56 years. One roof's always been enough." Evan nodded, "Maybe until it is." That was the thing about living in a place like Pine Ridge, Colorado. People didn't just measure winters by inches of snowfall. They measured them by memory. By the blizzard of '82 when roofs caved in. By the winter of '97 when the power stayed out for 11 days. Stories passed down like warnings, half legend, half pride. Evan paid, loaded his truck, and drove the long dirt road back up the mountain with the laughter still echoing in his ears. The cabin sat alone on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley, its log walls darkened by time and weather. Evan had built it himself 12 years earlier, back when he still believed solitude was the same thing as peace. It was sturdy, thick beams, steep pitch, metal roof designed to shed snow fast. It had held through storms that made the windows scream and the trees bow like they were praying. But last winter had been different. Evan remembered the sound most of all. Not the wind, not the snow, the groan. A low, aching moan that rolled through the rafters at 3 in the morning, pulling him out of sleep with his heart already racing. Dee stood barefoot on the cold floor, staring up as the roof flexed under a weight that felt alive. Snow had piled faster than it could slide. Ice had locked it in place, every gust pressed down like a hand. He'd gone outside with a shovel in the dark, headlamp cutting through white fury, scraping ice and snow until his arms shook and his breath burned. He'd done it again at dawn, and again the next night. The roof held barely. When spring finally came, Evan climbed up and saw the truth in the bent fasteners, the hairline cracks along the ridge beam. It wasn't failure yet, but it was a warning. So he started sketching. Neighbors noticed the lumber deliveries first. "Whatcha building now?" Mrs. Alvarez called from her porch one morning as Evan unloaded beams longer than his truck bed. "An idea," Evan said with a smile. She squinted. Ideas usually cost less wood. By midsummer, the frame of the second roof began to rise. Taller posts anchored outside the cabin walls, angled braces like ribs. It hovered above the original roof, separated by a 2-foot gap that caught the light and threw strange shadows. From the road, it looked like the cabin was wearing a hat too big for its head. That's when the laughing really started. Kids rode by on bikes and yelled, "Nice double-decker." Pickup trucks slowed just enough for someone to lean out a window and shout advice Evan didn't ask for. "You know snow just falls between, right? Trying to keep God out. Overkill man's." Evan worked anyway. He worked in the heat of July with sweat soaking his shirt and sawdust sticking to his skin. He worked in September cold, fingers numb, breath fogging as he tightened bolts and checked angles. Every cut was deliberate, every measurement double-checked. At night, he'd sit on the cabin steps, looking up at the structure silhouetted against the stars. Sometimes doubt crept in, quiet but persistent. What if they were right? He didn't have much money to spare. This wasn't a weekend project or a hobby, it was a gamble. If he was wrong, he'd wasted months and thousands of dollars on something that made him the town joke. But then he'd remember the groan of the rafters, the way fear had settled into his chest like ice, and he'd go back inside and sharpen his pencil. In October, the first snow dusted the peaks. Early light, almost playful, Evan stood outside as flakes drifted on and settled on the upper roof, sliding cleanly off the angled metal. Below it, the cabin roof stayed dry, protected. He felt a flicker of hope. Thanksgiving came with gray skies and warnings on the radio. Colder than average winter predicted, the meteorologist said. Increased snowfall possible in higher elevations. At the diner in town, the second roof became the main topic of conversation. "He's paranoid," Hank said, stabbing his fork into a stack of pancakes. "Building a bunker for snowflakes." "Or maybe he knows something we don't," Mrs. Alvarez replied quietly. Hank snorted, "Snow's snow." December arrived like a held breath. The first storm dropped 2 feet in 24 hours. Roads closed. Schools shut down. Evan stayed home, watching from the window as snow piled on the upper roof, then slid away in heavy sheets. The air gap trapped warmth, reduced ice. He checked everything twice a day, listening, feeling. No groaned. Power flickered but held. Wind howled, but the cabin stood firm, wrapped in a quiet that felt almost sacred. After the storm, a truck pulled up. Hank stepped out, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the structure. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Evan met him halfway down the drive. "Looks like it worked," Hank said, not quite meeting his eyes. "For one storm," Evan replied. Hank nodded. "Still think it's crazy." "Fair enough." Hank hesitated, then added, "Crazy-'s kept a lot of folks alive up here." Winter deepened. Storm followed storm, each one heavier than the last. Snowbanks rose like walls. The valley disappeared under white. Radios crackled with updates about supply delays and closed passes. Then in late January, the forecast changed tone. A low-pressure system stalled over the Rockies, pulling moisture from the Pacific and Arctic air from the north. Meteorologists used words like historic and dangerous. Wind gusts over 60 miles per hour. Snowfall measured not in inches, but feet. Evan stood outside the cabin as the sky darkened, an unease settling in his gut. This wasn't just another storm. This was something bigger, something that didn't care about jokes or pride. He secured shutters, checked fuel, charged radios. By nightfall, the first bands hit, wind-driven snow that erased the world beyond arm's reach. The second roof began to hum, a deep, steady vibration as gusts tore across it. Inside, the cabin was warm, too quiet. Around midnight, the power went out. The silence that followed was absolute. Evan lit lanterns, the soft glow casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing. Snow hammered the upper roof with relentless force. And then he heard it. Not from his own cabin. From somewhere down the ridge. A crack, a distant, hollow boom swallowed by the storm. Evan froze, lantern clenched in his hand, heart pounding. That wasn't thunder. That was a roof giving way. He stepped to the window, peering into the white chaos, knowing, deep down, that the real test hadn't even begun yet. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It tightened. By dawn, the wind had found a new pitch, higher, angrier, like it was screaming through clenched teeth. Snow no longer fell, it attacked. Sheets of white slammed sideways into the upper roof, rattling the metal panels hard enough to vibrate the windows. Evan lay awake on the couch, boots on, coat zipped, every sense tuned to the cabin's breathing. The generator kicked on with a cough, then steadied into a low growl. Heat returned to the vents, thin but steady. Evan exhaled and rubbed his face, the ruff of his beard grounding him. He checked the pressure gauges he'd installed between the roofs, something else people had laughed at. The needle held steady. So far, so good. Outside, the world was gone. The ridge, the trees, the valley, erased. Just wind and white and sound. Evan stepped onto the porch for a moment, the door barely cracking open before the storm shoved back. Snow blew in and stung his face like needles. He shut it fast, heart hammering. That crack he'd heard in the night wouldn't leave him alone. Down the ridge lived the Rawlins family. Old cabin, single roof, built back in the 70s. Good people, tough, the kind who believed in muscle and grit over gadgets and theories. Evan pictured their place buried under the same weight pressing down on his, imagined the sound of beams snapping. His radio crackled. "Anyone copy? This is county emergency. Power's out across Pine Ridge. Roads are impassable. We're asking residents to shelter in place." Evan grabbed the mic. "This is Calder on Ridge 12. I heard a structural collapse overnight. Sounded like it came from the lower ridge. Any reports?" Static, then a voice strained. "We've got multiple calls, Calder. Can't get to anyone until the wind drops." Evan set the radio down slowly. He wasn't reckless. He'd lived long enough to know when to stay put. But fear for others gnawed at him, sharp, ND insistent. He paced the cabin, listening to the storm, watching the lantern flame flicker. The first real test came mid-morning. A deep, concussive thud slammed into the cabin, followed by a long scrape. Evan flinched, eyes snapping to the ceiling. Snow, no ice, had shifted, slamming into the upper roof. The entire structure shuddered. He waited for the groan. It didn't come. Instead, the sound was different, controlled. The upper roof took the hit, redistributed the force, shed the weight in a roaring slide that dumped snow safely away from the walls. Evan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He checked the original roof from inside. Dry, solid. Hours blurred together. Wind howled without pause. The temperature dropped, cold seeping in despite insulation and heat. Evan rationed fuel, running the generator in intervals, keeping the pipes from freezing. By afternoon, the radio crackled again. Rawlins residents, roof compromised, anyone nearby. Evan was already pulling on his parka. The wind fought him every step as he pushed into it, leaning forward like he was climbing an invisible hill. Visibility was nothing. He followed memory more than sight, counting steps between trees, feeling for the slope under his boots. When he reached the Rawlins cabin, his chest tightened. The roof had collapsed inward, the weight of snow and ice crushing the center beam. One side wall bowed dangerously. Snow poured through the opening, burying furniture, swallowing rooms whole. "Hello," Evan shouted, voice torn away by the wind. "Tom, Lisa." A shape moved near the doorway. Tom Rawlins stumbled out, face gray, eyes wide. "Evan," his voice cracked with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Are you hurt?" Evan grabbed his arm, steadying him as a gust nearly knocked them both down. "Lisa's inside," Tom said, panic rising. "She twisted her ankle, can't put weight on it." Another crack echoed from the cabin, the structure settling further. "No," Evan said firmly. "We're not staying here." "How?" Tom shouted. "We can't see 10 feet." Evan glanced back toward the ridge where his cabin stood, protected, waiting. "You're coming with me." They moved fast, slow at the same time. Evan half-carried Lisa, her arms slung over his shoulder, her breath sharp with pain and fear. The wind clawed at them, trying to peel them apart. More than once, Evan felt the ground shift underfoot, snow hiding drop-offs, drifted paths. His legs burned. His lungs screamed. Through it all, one thought hammered in his mind: hold together. When his cabin finally loomed out of the white, it felt unreal, like a mirage. The second roof cut a dark, solid shape against the storm, standing firm while the world tried to tear itself apart. Inside, warmth hit them like a wave. Lisa broke down first, sobbing as Evan helped her to the couch. Tom stood frozen, staring up at the ceiling, at the unbroken roof beneath the second one. "My God," he whispered, "it's quiet." The storm still raged, but inside the sound was muted, controlled, safe. They tended Lisa's ankle, wrapped it tight. Evan made soup on the propane stove, the simple act grounding them all. They sat together, lantern light flickering, listening to the wind batter the upper roof. Every so often, a heavy impact would slam into it. Every time, the structure held. Night fell early, darkness pressing against the windows. The generator sputtered, then died. Silence again. Evan checked the fuel, froze in line. He swore under his breath, grabbed tools, and stepped into the air gap between the roofs through a hatch he'd built almost as an afterthought. Up there, the storm felt different. The upper roof took the full fury, wind screaming over it, snow piling and sliding away. Beneath it, in that narrow space, the air was calmer, warmer. He thawed the line with shaking hands, the storm roaring just feet above his head. For the first time, fear hit him hard and clean. If this failed, if the upper roof tore free, it wouldn't just be his life on the line anymore. He finished the repair and climbed back down, heart pounding. Inside, Tom looked at him with something like awe. "They laughed at you," he said quietly. "We all did." Evan sank into a chair, exhaustion pulling at his bones. "I laughed at myself sometimes." The storm intensified overnight, reaching a pitch that felt endless. Snow piled higher than the windows. The radio went dead. The world shrank to that single room and the steady, defiant presence of the second roof above them. Near dawn, a sound cut through the wind. A long, tearing shriek of metal. Evan bolted upright, eyes snapping to the ceiling, every muscle tensing as the cabin shuddered under a force greater than any before. The storm had one more move left. The cabin groaned, but it didn't collapse. Evan's heart raced, his hands gripping the edge of the table as another shriek of ice and metal cut across the ceiling. The upper roof flexed, rippling like a living thing, absorbing the storm's fury with a terrifying grace. Snow and wind slammed against it with relentless force, yet the original roof beneath stayed intact. The air gap between them acted like a buffer, a breathing space that turned what could have been disaster into a controlled struggle. "Is it supposed to do that?" Lisa whispered, voice trembling. She huddled under a blanket, eyes wide, still clutching her arm. Tom held her shoulder, but his gaze was fixed upward, a mixture of fear and awe. "Yes," Evan said, though even he didn't entirely believe it. "It's supposed to do exactly that." The storm had reached a violent crescendo, whipping the mountainside into a white frenzy. Trees bent under the wind, limbs snapping with sickening cracks. Snow drifted in walls, shifting like it had a mind of its own. Evan watched a gust rip a large branch from a nearby pine, toss it, and bury it in a bank 100 feet away. The sheer power of nature pressed in from every direction, relentless and indiscriminate. He moved toward the hatch leading to the space between the roofs. With every step, he could feel the cabin flex beneath him. He pried it open and crawled up into the gap, pulling himself along the narrow ledge. The roar of the wind intensified here, but the upper roof held firm, the corrugated panels bending and shaking but refusing to break. Evan pressed his hand against the cold metal. Every vibration, every shudder was a reminder of why he'd built it this way. Suddenly, a new fear gripped him. A massive sheet of ice, torn from a tree higher up the ridge, crashed down onto the upper roof. He felt the tremor travel through the metal, a pulse that sent his stomach into his throat. For a moment, he thought it would be the end. But the upper roof flexed, the ice sliding off, and the original roof below remained untouched. He exhaled, trembling. The design had worked better than he'd dared hope. Back inside, Lisa and Tom were whispering. "I never thought," Tom began, but the words trailed off. "I know," Evan said, descending from the hatch. "I didn't either, until last year, until I heard that groan." Hours passed like minutes, each one testing the limits of endurance. The storm didn't weaken, it only shifted, changing direction, gaining strength, bending trees to their knees. The small cabin had become a sanctuary, a fragile fortress held together by sweat, foresight, and stubbornness. Evan moved from room to room, checking lanterns, stacking firewood, rationing water, and keeping watch. The storm was not done with them. Around midnight, another sound sliced through the wind, a loud crack followed by the distant but unmistakable rumble of collapsing wood. It wasn't the cabin, not this time. Evan froze, straining to locate the source. He grabbed the radio. Static hissed back at him, but a faint voice emerged. "County emergency, multiple collapses, ridge area, snow drift. Stay indoors, do not venture out." The words sent a chill down his spine. Pine Ridge, their entire community, was being hammered mercilessly. Roads buried, cabins crushed, people trapped. And yet in the middle of this apocalypse, Evan's cabin, his double-roofed design, stood defiantly against the storm. "Why didn't anyone listen?" Lisa murmured, her eyes reflecting both fear and awe. Evan shook his head. "Some lessons you learn the hard way." Morning arrived sluggishly, light diffused through layers of snow and clouds. The storm had finally slowed, though the wind still howled in bursts. Evan stepped outside for the first time in nearly 24 hours. The valley below was unrecognizable, a frozen wasteland of white, broken tree limbs and the remnants of structures flattened by snow. He looked back at the cabin, the second roof dusted with snow but unbroken, proud in its stubbornness. For the first time, he felt a surge of triumph, mingled with relief so sharp it almost hurt. Tom followed him outside, helping Lisa along. Both of them took in the sight of Evan's cabin in stunned silence. I don't know what to say," Tom finally said. "I didn't believe you," we all laughed. Evan nodded slowly. "I didn't know either until now." They stood there for a long moment, the devastation around them making the intact cabin seem almost miraculous. And in a way, it was. It wasn't luck. It was preparation, foresight, and a refusal to be limited by convention or ridicule. By afternoon, neighbors began to emerge cautiously from their own shelters. Eyes wide, they surveyed the destruction. Stories of collapsed roofs and buried homes spread quickly, and then they came to Evans Ridge. Some approached quietly, hesitant. Others shouted, pointing. The same people who had laughed now stared with a mixture of shock, admiration, and something like guilt. Mrs. Alvarez was first. She stood at the bottom of the cabin steps, hand on her heart. "Evan, you saved them," she said, voice trembling. "Saved who?" He, scared though he already knew. "Everyone who could have been trapped," she replied. "If it weren't for your roof, God, Evan." The truth settled over the ridge like a new snow. Evan had built not just a roof, but a shield, a defiance against the mountain itself. The storm that had flattened so many homes, that had trapped people and threatened lives, had been stopped at his cabin. For the first time in a long while, Evan allowed himself to feel pride. Not the pride of ego or of proving others wrong, but the quiet, deep satisfaction of knowing that his labor, his stubbornness, and his foresight had made a difference. The valley was silent now, broken only by the wind still rattling some of the weaker structures. Evan looked down at Tom and Lisa, at Mrs. Alvarez, at neighbors cautiously circling the cabin, and he realized something important. People don't always understand foresight. They don't always see the point until the consequences are unavoidable. And sometimes, what seems foolish in ordinary times becomes extraordinary when the storm comes. He climbed back onto the porch, brushing snow from his shoulders. The second roof gleamed faintly under the gray light, a quiet monument to stubbornness, foresight, and survival. And somewhere deep in him, Evan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: connection. Not just to the land or to the cabin he'd built, but to the people around him. To a community that had mocked him and now depended on him. This storm had changed everything. And he knew, in a way that made his chest ache, that life on the mountain would never be the same. Because sometimes it takes a storm to show who you really are and what you're capable of. The days that followed the blizzard felt surreal, like the mountain itself had shifted under their feet. Pine Ridge slowly emerged from its snowbound shell. Roads were cleared, though only barely. Neighbors dug out what they could, revealing broken roofs, crushed porches, and vehicles swallowed by drifts. But Evan's cabin remained untouched, standing like a sentinel amid the wreckage. Word spread quickly. People came from other ridges, curious at first, then hesitant, and finally with a kind of reverent awe. Cameras flashed from phones, neighbors recorded videos, and for once, Evan didn't feel the irritation he usually did at attention. This wasn't about pride. It was proof that planning, persistence, and stubbornness could survive even the harshest tests. Tom and Lisa stayed for a week, recuperating in Evan's cabin. The warmth, food, and safety he'd prepared felt like a miracle to them, and they couldn't stop praising him. But Evan brushed it off, tired but quietly satisfied. "I just did what I had to do," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, the orange glow illuminating tired, grateful faces. The roof, it wasn't genius, it was necessity. Lisa looked at him, her eyes shining. It saved us. It saved everyone who couldn't get out. That's genius. Evan allowed himself a small smile. Guess maybe. By the end of the week, the ridge was slowly returning to life. Neighbors rebuilt fences, cleared driveways, and checked on each other. Conversations shifted from horror at the storm to admiration for the cabin on the ridge, the one with the second roof. Children who had once yelled and laughed now pressed their noses against the windows, wide-eyed and silent. Hank Mullins approached Evan one morning, carrying a thermos of coffee, the wind whipping his gray hair. For a long moment, he just stared at the cabin, then at Evan. "You did it," Hank said, voice low and earnest. "I didn't think it could stand against that mess." Evan shrugged, brushing snow from his sleeves. "It was meant to stand." Hank shook his head, a grin breaking through his usual gruffness. "Stubborn as ever, huh? Guess stubbornness pays off sometimes." Evan let out a short laugh. "Sometimes it does." By late February, the cleanup had reached a rhythm. The Rawlins cabin was partially repaired. Lumber and supplies were scarce, but Evan lent tools, expertise, and encouragement. The community had changed in subtle ways. They were quieter now, more attentive to each other, and perhaps more willing to consider what might seem unusual, unconventional, or even foolish. Evan returned to his cabin one afternoon, standing on the porch, looking up at the second roof dusted with fresh snow. The mountains around him were serene now, the storm's fury replaced by an icy calm. He felt a deep sense of connection to the land he had chosen, to the elements he had survived, and to the people he had helped protect. Sometimes, he thought, the hardest winters teach the most important lessons. About resilience, about foresight, about courage, about humility, and about community. The neighbors who had once mocked him now nodded respectfully when they passed. Children waved, pointing up at the upper roof like it was a symbol of heroism. And Evan, quiet and steady as Ev, continued to live simply, working with his hands, tending his cabin and keeping watch over the ridge. That night, after the valley had quieted and the stars shone cold and clear, Evan lit a single lantern and climbed up to the gap between the roofs. He pressed his hand against the upper metal, feeling its cool solidity. "You did good," he murmured, almost to himself. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, soft now, no longer a threat but a reminder of what had been endured. The ridge slept under a blanket of white, the cabins battered but surviving, and the Calder cabin stood tall, proof that foresight and determination could prevail against even the harshest storms. And in that quiet under the second roof, Evan felt something rare, a sense of triumph not born of victory over others, but of survival, preparation, and the knowledge that sometimes, being a little different, a little stubborn, and a little forward-thinking can make all the difference. The storm had passed, the mountain had tested them, and the Calder cabin with its unusual, ridiculed second roof had passed the test. Evan sat back, letting the warmth of the lantern and the glow of survival fill him. Outside, the ridge was quiet, peaceful, but forever changed. And for the first time in years, Evan allowed himself to relax completely, knowing that when the mountain raged again, and it would, he would be ready. Because sometimes the difference between disaster and salvation isn't luck. It's foresight, it's preparation, and sometimes it's a roof built just a little differently. The wind whistled gently over the peaks, carrying the faint sound of laughter, not mocking but appreciative, echoing down the ridge, a soft reminder that survival isn't just about weathering storms. It's about the choices you make before they hit. Evan leaned back, eyes tracing the lines of the second roof, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had built more than a cabin. He had built security. He had built hope. And in a world that could be as cruel as it was beautiful, sometimes that was enough. The ridge was quiet now, but its story had changed forever, and those who had once laughed would never forget. The end.